Honestly, learning Japanese was never really that hard. I don't really know why. I don't want to sound like arrogant or conceited, but it kind of felt to me like coming home, kind of.
What's up, KoreKara squad? Welcome back to the podcast. Before we get started, make sure to absolutely annihilate the like button. So this week we talked to Wonmin, who is a native Korean speaker and board game developer, and he's passed the JLPT N1. So in this episode, we find out just how easy it is to learn Japanese if you already know Korean. And spoiler,
just like that,
it might be even easier than knowing Chinese.
it might be even easier. Well, without further ado, hope you guys enjoy the podcast.
All right, so can you give us a quick background of who you are and where you're at today?
Yeah, sure. So my name is Wonmin. It's pronounced like 1 minute. I was born in South Korea, but I moved to New York City when I was young, and I, raised in New York City, Queens. Went to school in the United States. I took Japanese in high school, and in college I took some Chinese, 4 years of it actually, so not some Chinese. And then after a while, life got in the way, working. I didn't do anything with Japanese or Chinese. And then one day I just decided to, take a solo trip to Japan, Hokkaido, and realized how crappy my Japanese has gotten. So that's when I decided to, start studying again, and then, passed N2, passed N1. And after that, or during all of that, I was also working on starting my own board game company. Made a board game, and I'm currently in the process of making a second board.
I see.
Wow.
So how long did it take from when you decided to really study Japanese to passing N1?
So in high school, I took 4 years of it, right? So counting those 4 years, and then I did maybe a little less than a year of self-study, and then I passed N2, and then another year of self-study, and then I passed N1.
I see.
So I guess in total 6 years.
I see. And you spoke Korean natively?
Yep. So at home, I speak Korean with my parents and my family. Obviously, I live in America, so I speak English with my friends and at my job.
Right.
And Japanese, I currently only speak with, random online friends. I speak with my girlfriend. She speaks some Japanese. Yeah.
She speaks some Japanese, so is she
Okay.
Korean?
She speaks Japanese. She's much better than me, but let's see, how do I put it? Her situation is a little interesting too, because she's born and raised in Korea, but she spent most of her adult life in Japan. So she's not really Korean and not really Japanese, a weird mixture, half. But she's ethnically Korean, but her Japanese is completely fluent. So.
Oh, wow.
So that's the main language you guys talk in, is Japanese?
Well, we talk in a mix of Korean and Japanese.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
That's
So it's I would start my sentence in Japanese and then throw in Korean words in there, or end in Korean, or some phrases I don't know how to say in Japanese or I don't know how to say in Korean. It's just a weird flow of back and forth.
I see.
Right.
Yeah, I feel like in the last couple string of podcasts, we've had kind of a theme of girlfriends. Kind of, I feel like having knowing the target language. It's kind of funny how it kind of all plays out right here.
Honestly, that's probably the best way to learn a language, is to date someone who only speaks that language. Aside from actually moving to the country itself, that's probably the best way.
Right, perfect. Yeah. All our listeners are ready to go, but we'll put a quick disclaimer out here. We don't want anyone going and doing any creepy stuff and be like, "Oh, I heard that from the KoreKara podcast."
Yeah, but one thing I was curious about is, you always hear the similarities between Korean, Japanese, or Chinese, and in my experience, I already spoke Chinese before I started learning Japanese, and there were a lot of similarities. But what would you say are the similarities between Korean, Japanese? Did you have an advantage?
I think I'm a little biased because that's the order I learned it is, the order I learned it. But I think understanding Korean really, really helps you with Japanese grammar. I'm sure other people might have told you this as well, but the grammar structure is basically the same thing. which is why I'm able to speak in a mix of Korean and Japanese with my girlfriend so easily, because honestly, you start a sentence one way and you could end it in another language, because it's so interchangeable. The way that conjugations happen, the way that the grammar structure is set up, like subject, verb, and like all that. And having another thing about learning English before Japanese, because Korean was my first language, is that a lot of Korean people have a hard time pronouncing certain Japanese characters, like tsu, or like any of the Z characters, like stuff like that. And they have a very strong Korean accent when they speak Japanese. But English, like I can pronounce TSU, that's like saying cats, that's TSU. I can pronounce Z because English has a lot of Z words. So learning Korean first helped me learn learn Japanese grammar structure much easier. And learning English helped me pronounce Japanese better than I'd say a regular Korean person might.
Right. So you actually have all the advantages.
Yeah. I don't know.
Actually, I felt a similar way, because like when I learned Japanese, I would know all the Chinese, the two kanji Chinese words, and I also know the katakana like English words. So it would be like, then it's like easy to learn new vocab.
Definitely.
But are there specific examples you can think of like a similarity, maybe grammar or vocabulary between like Korean and Japanese?
I mean, straight up, like the words sound very similar. Like, in Japanese, like mushi suru, like to ignore. In Korean, it's the exact same word, like mushi. Like the pronunciation is very, very like slightly different, like mushi in Japanese. I'm not that great at it, but in Korean it feels a little softer, like mushi. I don't know. It's just like some of the words, because obviously they're all derived from Chinese characters, like they're very similar, like in how they sound. So that is one that sounds very similar.
Yeah, I noticed that when I watched Squid Game, because I heard yakusoku in Korean.
Yakusoku, in Korean it's yakusok, it's the same thing.
Right. Definitely, when I'm going and watching all the Korean dramas, it's weird to me. I'm like, I feel like I know like part of these, like hear the word again. Yeah. And I guess then conversely, also as a native Korean speaker, were there some parts of Japanese that were maybe a little bit more difficult for you?
Honestly, learning Japanese was never really that hard. I don't really know why. Like I don't want to sound like arrogant or conceited, but it kind of felt to me like coming home, because when I immigrated to the US, I actually forgot a lot of my Korean because I moved at such a young age, and I had to like relearn Korean when I was older, like in high school. And at a point in my life, I was very fluent in Korean, obviously, when I lived there. And then when I moved to the US, I forgot a lot of it. I became very fluent in English. And then I had to make a conscious effort to relearn Korean. And that was around the same time I was learning Japanese. So being in a school setting, like a official academic setting where I was learning Japanese, because it was so similar grammatically to Korean, it kind of felt like I was getting back in touch with my roots, kind of. And when I was learning Japanese, it felt very natural to me. Everything came so like, I remember all of the conjugations and all of the like grammatical like structures and patterns of it like came very naturally to me. That's probably because of my Korean background. I don't really know though.
You're really able to gather all the infinity stones.
Yep.
Yeah, just download Japanese instantly. So when you were taking Japanese in high school, were you like just so much ahead of everyone else, like the first year?
Yeah, I mean, it's not just because of my Korean background though. I did put a lot of effort into studying it. I had like a Japanese tutor outside of high school, and that was fun. It was less strict. It was just kind of like hanging out with a friend almost. I also studied abroad in Japan over the summers, so that definitely, I guess, gave me an advantage compared to my classmates. Yeah, but I guess it's a mix of different things.
I see. And one thing I also heard is that just the pronunciation of words in not words but like the consonants are very similar. So
yeah,
I guess like, do people mistake you for being a native speaker of Japanese?
No, I don't think so. Like, I think people, when they look at me, they can kind of understand, like, yeah, your Japanese is good, but you're not native. Like, it's probably, how I look, how I dress, how I carry out, like, how I, like, present myself. People can, it's just crazy. Like, that's one of my, like, life goals, to be, like, mistaken for a Japanese person. Like, that would be awesome, to be like, oh my God, I didn't know you were not Japanese. That's crazy. But then, it's really hard to fool a native person. They look at you, the way you dress, the way you talk, the way you walk, anything, and they just form a mental image of you. And they realize, hey, you're not Japanese. I don't know what it is. But, I can kind of see the same thing, because I'm American now. So if I see someone who is not American, instantly my brain can recognize, like, patterns, like, oh, they're dressed a certain way, they talk a certain way, stuff like that. So
I guess, like, on the internet, you said you have, like, internet friends.
Oh, on the internet, yeah. That's,
would they know?
It's much easier to fool people on the internet, I guess. Yeah.
Right. I see. So in a way, you may have hit your goal of fooling people.
Yeah, on the internet, it's totally possible. But the longer I talk, the more likely it is that I trip up and I make a stupid mistake somewhere. So
right. Yeah, maybe you have to, next time you go to Japan, you just go fully, like, method actor into the whole being a Japanese person for like 5 minutes and then moving on to the next person.
I have to, pretend to be a Japanese salaryman, put on a suit, pretend like I have no soul and just hate my life every day.
Exactly. You got it all covered.
But yeah, I just like was thinking, like, is really Japanese that easy for Korean people? Like, actually, step 1, learn Korean, step 2, learn Japanese.
Yeah, fast track learning Japanese by learning Korean first.
True. I mean, that kind of goes into kind of one of our inside jokes of the podcast. Eric mentioned the step 1, step 2. Usually it's step 1, learn Chinese, step 2, learn Japanese. And you're kind of in a unique scenario where you know Korean, obviously, and you have N1 level in Japanese, and then you spent 4 years learning Chinese. So I guess if you could rearrange these steps in terms of a step 1, 2, maybe even 3, what would you say is the most optimal in your mind? Really?
I think Korean, Chinese, Japanese is the best order.
I see.
Because
English, you gotta learn English.
Oh yeah, English. English after Korean.
Okay.
So
okay.
I think that would be the best order, because Korean, you get a good base of, like, the Chinese, like, 2-letter words, because Korean has a lot of the same 2-letter words, 2-character words. And then you learn English for the pronunciation of, like, some harder, for some stuff that you can't pronounce in Korean. And you learn Chinese to pronounce Chinese stuff. Because if you learned Japanese before learning Chinese, then your Chinese would be really bad, and the pronunciation of your Chinese would be very bad, because you can only speak Japanese and Korean and English.
Right.
I don't know.
There you go. Everyone listening, that's the roadmap now.
Yeah, the KoreKara roadmap. We'll be selling our course.
Yeah, featuring Wonmin. Step 1.
Learn 4 languages in 1 year.
Exactly. Become extremely proficient in all of them, with the Japanese being the most at the end. You got all the resources down. Yeah, I mean, one thing you also mentioned was that you studied abroad. So, I mean, that's always, personally for Eric and I, that was one of the main factors in improving our Japanese. But how much would you say it helped you, and how long were you there for?
So in high school, I went pretty much every summer, but each summer was a very different amount of time. But more recently, I think the best help, the most helpful thing to learn Japanese recently when I was getting back into it was watching Terrace House. I know you guys had Yusuke on recently, which is how I discovered you guys. And watching Terrace House with Japanese subtitles was probably like the most helpful thing that I've done to learn Japanese besides going to Japan. That was hands down the best.
I see. I mean, perfect that you mentioned that, because, I mean, again, you just like you mentioned that you found out about us through when we had Yusuke or Eden Kai on. The crazy how you get to connect to people here. Yeah. But one story you kind of had is that you actually applied to be on the show a couple times, right?
Yeah, to absolute, radio silence on their end. I really don't think it's, they advertise it as like, oh, anyone can apply and anyone can join, but I really think it's a form of like you need to have some sort of connections in the industry to get in.
Yeah, that's what I think as well. Especially like
100%.
The latest season, like almost every person kind of got through their like Jimusho.
Yeah, exactly. So maybe in the first season it wasn't like that. So I don't know. So I applied definitely like maybe like a decade too late, but
unfortunate. But I mean, you actually did something. You're working on something a little bit even better than that, though, right? Where your next board game in the works, which is what you named Share Home, which is basically kind of simulating the whole Terrace House. I don't know if we want to say Terrace House, but the whole idea of being in a share home, which I have heard some secrets that it might be going some changes, but you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So this board game is like the real life embodiment of like that Futurama, that Bender meme. Do you know? Like, screw you guys, I'm gonna make like my own whatever with hookers and cocaine or whatever, something like that. You guys know that meme, right?
Yeah.
So basically, that's my answer to not getting accepted into Terrace House. Like, screw you, Fuji TV and Netflix. I'm gonna make my own Terrace House. And what am I good at? I'm good at making board games. I'm good at making games. So I'm gonna make my own game and have it here. It's called Share Home. Yeah. So it's basically a card game where you play. It's basically Terrace House, your card game, where you play as members on the show, reenact crazy scenes that happened on the show, like the meat incident or whatever. And it's just like a really fun time. I started a New York City Terrace House viewing party back when the show was still going on, and we would watch every week. After the show was over, we'd play my game, and everyone was having a good time. It was really fun. But unfortunately, the show, got canceled due to all the scandals and all the bad stuff that happened with it. That's terrible. So I'm kind of, stuck in this weird situation where, I have this game now. So what am I going to do with it? I obviously can't, use the Terrace House name or the brand. So I'm actually in the middle of, rebranding it, change it, like moving away from Terrace House, moving away from kind of like based on a real show, and make it more like a fantasy, make it more like creating my own characters, like based on like mythical creatures, fantasy tropes, stuff. So it's basically Terrace House, the card game, but with dragons, orcs, elves and stuff like that. So
I see.
Yeah. I don't know how that'll work out, but we'll see.
But I guess kind of closing out now, I mean, you've accomplished so much in terms of creating your own board games here, as well as getting to an N1 level in Japanese. But now, looking forward, what would you say are some of your goals for the future?
So yeah, my short-term goals are definitely, finishing this game, finishing the Share Home game, rebranding it, making it a little distance from Terrace House. I'm hoping to do like a simultaneous release in both America and Japan, because if you go to the website, I like translated all of the rules and everything into Japanese as well.
Right.
So hoping I could have like Japanese fans enjoy the game and, American fans and, because Terrace House, the appeal of it was, kind of global, international. Another cool goal would be, in Tokyo, there's this thing called Game Market where like indie game developers bring their board games and then they just all set up booths and sell it. That would be awesome if I could bring it there and sell it there. That would be kick-ass. I have no idea how to do that, but I could learn. Future goals. That's pretty much it. I honestly, I never really studied Japanese with like a clear goal in mind. It was just fun for me, and I like learning the language. I like speaking it, and I'm at a point where I'm good enough where I can like consume Japanese media, play Japanese games, watch Japanese shows without really relying on subtitles or English translations. And I think that's okay, and that's okay for the rest of my life. I just enjoy Japanese content, and I don't need to push myself further. I don't need to study Anki every day. I don't need to stress myself out. Learning, taking the next test. Getting more and more fluent. That's not really my goal. As long as I can play my weeb games or watch anime, I'm good.
And what are those weeb games and anime?
I want to play. Well, I recently finished Xenoblade Chronicles on the Switch. I want to play the second one. I haven't been able to buy it yet. Just haven't had the time. But
right.
Just a bunch of like JRPGs, basically.
Right. The true games of culture.
Yeah.
You love to see it. I mean, hopefully in the new iteration of Share Home, we'll be able to have a dwarf asking an elf to go get dinner, get rejected, and ordering catfish by themselves. But
yeah, nice. Taking notes right now.
Perfect. We got you. Gotta have a special KoreKara card somewhere in there.
Yeah, sure.
Oh, okay. I'm even more excited now than I already was. Well, everyone, be sure to go check out the progress of the games, and you also have another game out already with with Sisyphus, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is that one behind you?
Corp.
It's right here. Stab your coworkers in the
I was
back.
looking at that sign. I'm like, wow, that's intense.
Yeah, I saw a couple of the videos you put out for promotional material. It was pretty intense. Oh man,
it's meant to be eye-catching.
All right. Hopefully, it's nothing too physical happens when playing the game.
Oh, there's nothing like that. Yeah.
Yeah, I checked some out though. It looks really fun to play, and excited to hopefully play some soon myself. But at the end of all our podcasts, I'm sure you've seen it, Wonmin, but we have the special message, the one that encapsulates it all, which can be anything, any language, any message, anything. That's up to you with the light shining bright. Wonmin, today, what is your KoreKara message?
My KoreKara message to all you Japanese learners and studiers out there, don't push yourself so hard. You're learning a language to have fun. Ultimately, you're learning it to, speak with other people. So stop worrying about your Anki decks and, go out there and talk to more people, whether that's online or in person. That's what you got to do to keep motivation high, because Anki is not the way.
There, you heard it. Anki is not the way. Quoted by Wonmin. I don't want to say anything controversial myself.
Hey guys, thanks for making it to the end of the podcast.
Comment down below what you think the optimal steps are to learning the best Japanese. But as always, want to quickly thank our patrons: Faraz, Brit vs. Japan, Quaid, Alan, Card, Cage, 90, Drew, Jack, Yui, Sad Boy, and finally, Jonathan.
Yeah, damn, it's like a rap god. Put the music.
Yo, I'm rapping these patrons out here, dude. We have like we put the beat, this is like the rap god beat. Just have me saying the patrons. For Roz Brit versus Japan.